Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Elevate webinar on exam preparation. We're going to be starting in just about 2 or 3 minutes at 6 o'clock. So if you're already here, thanks for being early. Maybe take this moment to grab a cup of tea, grab a glass of wine, grab maybe some paper and some a pen if you want to take any notes, and we'll be starting at just after 6. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so it's just gone 6. We're just going to give people another minute or so just to join, and then we will begin. Okay, fantastic. So let's make a start. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Molly. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for this Elevate Parents webinar focused on exam preparation. I know this is a very strange and difficult time at the moment, going back into a national lockdown. So I'd just like to take this moment to say I really hope you and your family are doing well and are keeping safe. And thank you so much for making this time in what I'm sure is a very busy evening for you all with dinner and homework and everything else that you've got going on to actually join me this evening for this webinar. Thank you very much. So if you joined our previous webinar last month, you would have seen me presenting about time management. Or if you missed that session, you may have attended another one of our webinars. Then you may have met my colleague, either Jack or Megan. So as I said before, my name is Molly. I'm a senior coach and a presenter with Elevate. And that means that my role involves meeting with families through Zoom to match them with an Elevate coach and determine exactly how we should tailor a coaching program to individual children, to your children, to make their lives easier in the classroom and to help them realise their true potential. That's what Elevate coaching is. Then in the presenting side of it, that means that I actually go into schools and I deliver seminars all across the UK with both parents, teachers, and of course students as well. So tonight I'm going to be bringing that wealth of experience that I have in my many years with Elevate to discuss exam preparation. So after speaking with many parents and teachers, it's very clear that at the moment everybody is a little bit stressed and, you know, especially in regards to exams. Your child may have already sat some exams this year, or they may have some exams coming up in the next few weeks or months, or they may be having exams sort of early next year. Many parents that I have spoken to at the moment have said that actually they're finding that their children are more stressed than ever about exams, which is completely understandable with the experience from the summer, making a lot of students worry about whether their mocks will be, you know, ending up to determine their final grades. So what we're going to talk about, what tonight is all about really, is helping children prepare effectively for those exams, and also really crucially helping to minimize any stress that may arise in that process as well. So in terms of the structure for this evening, it will be similar to any other webinars if you've attended those. So I'll give you just a brief overview about Elevate, about where our research comes from and who we are, and then just to get everybody on the same page there. Then I'll hop into the content for this evening, and then we'll finish with a bit of a Q&A. So the whole event, the whole of this evening should run for about an hour, so we should be wrapping up about 7 p.m. So before we get started and dive into that content, there's 2 things that I would like to address. Firstly, I'd love if everybody could find the chat window. So if you're on our website at the moment watching this, then the chat bubble will just be in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you don't see it, that might be because you've got pop-ups disabled. So if you go into your internal settings and you enable pop-ups, then you'll be able to see that chat window. If you're watching us on YouTube, you won't have that chat window. So for the questionnaire section, if you could just write your answers down on a bit of paper, that would be fantastic. And if you do want to access the chat bubble, you can actually click to the link that will take you to our website, which is in the description underneath that YouTube video. And throughout the night, if you have any questions, as we always say, please pop them into that chat box, because Charlie, who is our head of coaching, will be monitoring that chat throughout the evening. She'll be taking all of your questions, she'll collate them, she'll pass them through to me, and then I'll get to answer some of them in the Q&A at the end. So any question you have, please just pop it into that chat box. Secondly, the second thing I want to address is that I'm sure many of you will already have had this thought. I am not a parent myself. I'm not here in any way to, give parenting advice. Far from it. Probably some of you are looking at me right now thinking, you look, a slightly older than my own child who's in year 12. I am aware I look a little bit young. I'm not a parent at all. What I am here to do is to just talk you through some practical strategies and tips that you can use with your own children, which are based on Elevate's research and this 19 years worth of experience that we have. So talking a little bit about Elevate there, let's go into a little bit more detail. Apologies if you have seen this before and you've joined us before for a webinar, but I just want to make sure that we're all sort of starting on the same point. So I'll just give you a brief overview about Elevate and about what we do. So Elevate started as a research company. We started 19 years ago in 2001. And we started with one core premise, which was to find out how top performing students get those top marks. I'm sure that you can appreciate that a lot of students tend to have a bias towards thinking that the students who do best, who get those top marks, are just naturally smarter than the rest. So following that sort of line of thinking of students with higher IQs get better marks. However, what our research revealed to us is that although IQ obviously is a variable that is correlated with academic success, it is far from being the whole picture. Instead, what we found is that there are 13 key study skill areas that are far better correlated with how students will achieve and the results that they will get. And what I mean by that, these 13 key study areas, is how they study. What do they do when they're at their desk? How do they organise their time? How do they move through that process of revision? These tend to have a much bigger impact, more than IQ, on actually what students are able to achieve. So it's these 13 key study habits, which we spent the last 19 years researching, and now we're in an incredibly fortunate position to be able to work with over 3,000 students across 15 countries, 3,000 schools, in 15 countries, 1 million students across those 3,000 schools, and hundreds of families as well privately in our coaching program. So that is basically Elevate in a nutshell. That's what we do. So if you would like to hear more as well about the coaching side of Elevate, then what you can do is there's actually a calendar embedded in on our website where you're watching the video now. That will link you straight through to Charlie, our head of coaching's calendar, and you can book a phone appointment to just chat through how coaching could possibly work for you and your family. And I'll tell you a little bit more information about that at the end as well. So let's dive in. So now that we're on the same page, I would like you to meet Aaron. This is obviously not a photo of Aaron, although this photo does represent Aaron pretty well at the stage that we met him. So to give you a little bit of context, I first met Aaron through our private coaching program when I ran a diagnostic session with him. So a diagnostic session is the sort of the first step in Elevate's coaching process, and what it is we sit down over Zoom, and we really get an understanding of where a student is at the moment, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, how they're feeling about the year, and that information then allows us to tailor a coaching program specifically for them. So when I first met Aaron, he was very, very cool, very sweet kid, but as soon as I mentioned the word exams, instantly his whole disposition changed. The reason I'd mentioned it was because I was asking him within this diagnostic sort of, how do you prepare, Aaron? What sort of things do you do to prepare for exams? And instantly you could see this wave of anxiety almost hit Aaron straight in the face. This was something that I was expecting. His mum, Anita, had sort of already briefed me that Aaron experienced quite a lot of anxiety around exams, and this had been a really big challenge for him and for the whole family. He tended to get very overwhelmed prior to exams. He had a couple of sort of meltdown moments in the lead up to exams, and he'd also actually, unfortunately, had them in the exam room itself. This had affected his previous year's sort of end of term exams, and meant that it was a stumbling block that Anita and him really wanted to tackle. So from that diagnostic, we booked in an 8-week coaching program with Aaron. And across that time, we actually managed to boost his marks from the start of the program to the end by 30% on average across all his subjects. And I don't say that to sort of, toot our own horn and say, oh, wow, this is the most amazing thing. It's more that our core value at Elevate is to help the kids. That is what Elevate is all about. So we talk about help the kids moments. And for me, as a diagnostic consultant and as a coach as well, this was one of the greatest sort of help the kids moments for me, because I'd seen Aaron come from this place of a real lack of confidence, really, having sort of serious jitters about exams, moving through to actually being really well prepared and feeling incredibly confident when he went into those exams. And confidence is a word that I think is key here, because although, obviously seeing that improvement in his grades was fantastic, what was I think actually more important for me was seeing that flip in his confidence and seeing that, I knew that he would hopefully be set up for future exams. It was really rewarding for all of us. And I share this story with you about Aaron because what I'm going to do this evening is talk you through that 4-step process that we put in place for Aaron so that you can put it into practice yourselves with your own children straight away, starting from today. So I'm sure that some of you right now will be sitting at home with children who, have suffered in a similar way to Aaron, with maybe feeling overwhelmed, feeling anxiety to do with exams, or possibly there are some of you as well who are sort of at the other end of the spectrum and are maybe dealing with quite a lot of exam apathy. They're both going to be things that we're going to cover and talk about this evening. So, before we actually dive into the content, we will start with a little questionnaire, a little quiz, as we do before. These are really just questions to find out where your child is currently at and how they're currently studying. The reason being, obviously, is before we can solve these specific problems, we need to understand actually what's the root causes of them. So please feel free to use the chat box to actually pop your answers in there. That way they can go through to Charlie and through to me, or if you can't access that, no worries at all, just jot them down on a little bit of paper. So Charlie's going to send me over the common trends after so I can get a sense of where everyone's at. So there are 5 questions. I will fly through them quite quickly. And these are questions as well that we ask of every student in our coaching program in that diagnostic session. So it's going to give some great context to the next 4-step exam prep process that we're going to be covering in a few moments. A word of warning as well, is if you do have a question that you'd like to submit for our Q&A, I would just say probably don't submit it right now, because if you pop it in the chat box now, it's going to get buried under a lot of sort of A, B, C's, D's from this quiz. So if you do have a question, hold on to it for a few moments and pop it in the chat after that. Fantastic. So the first question 1, is what is your child's favourite subject? So we've grouped some of the subjects together here, you can see. So we've got A as maths, B is English, C, sciences, D, languages, and E, humanities. So which is your child's favourite subject? Which one of those does it fall into? Great. So question 2, the flip side of that is, what is your child's least favourite subject? So is it A, maths, B, English, C, science, D, languages, or E, humanities? And unfortunately, we couldn't fit on all of the subjects there. So if you could just go with the answer that the best fits your child's favourite and least favourite subject. Fantastic. So question 3. Question 3 is very important, especially for students who are studying their GCSEs or A-levels. If your child is in year 9 or below, it's still relevant. We're going to cover how it works slightly differently and terminology is slightly different, but I'll cover that later on. So question 3 is, my child has downloaded their specification for each subject. A, yes, that's true. B, no. Or C, I don't know. If it's C, I don't know, that is absolutely fine. Again, we're going to be really diving into what a specification is and how students can use it later on in the webinar. So just to give you a little bit of clarification now, so a specification is a document that all students can download that just tells them everything they'll need to know in that particular subject and how they're going to be examined on that subject. These documents, specifications, are found on exam board websites, and they're a really, really useful resource, and we're going to go into a bit more detail later on how to use them. So, question number 4 is, how does your child prepare for exams? Or slightly to reword that is, what is the main task that your child is doing before an exam? So is that main task A, writing notes, B, memorization, C, practice questions or practice papers, D, other? If it is other, please specify, that'd be fantastic to know. Or is it E, I don't know? So, just while those answers are coming in, I can see them flooding in here. I'd just like to sort of add that if your child is doing A or B, so writing notes or memorization as their main task, it's not the worst thing in the world, but what it tends to be is that students who get the top marks will be focusing more on C, on practice papers and practice questions. This is something that I know Megan discussed in her webinar that she did in September. Really crucially, it's how they approach those practice papers, which was a really big issue that we had with Aaron actually, and it's going to be something that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in a moment. So, final question, question number 5 is, does your child use an exam planner? A, yes, B, no, or C, I don't know. Of course, an exam planner can take many different forms, but really here I'm just asking, do you or do they sit down with you or with a friend, and do they make a plan prior to exams, is really what I'm asking there. Okay, fantastic. So answers are coming through. And so while Charlie just collates those responses and sends them over to me, I'd like to share this quote with you by Louis Pasteur, the French philosopher. So he said, chance favours the prepared mind. This is one of the most important things for a student to understand, but also, of course, for you as parents and carers, and for us as educators as well. So preparation is key in anything in life that we need to do, a skill that we need to develop, but especially when it comes to school and exams. So after asking a lot of students, why do you think that some students do well in exams and others don't? Many students, I've genuinely heard this response many times, is that they feel that some students just have this sort of random exam gene, which means that they're just amazing at exams, amazing at nailing every single question. As I'm sure you can appreciate, that is obviously not the case. That doesn't exist. That is false. Yet there is a reason that some students are good in the exam room, but that is almost always due to preparation. They've prepared for it more effectively than anyone else. And this, again, was one of the commonalities that we found in our research for what top performing students do. They had a very clear framework of how they prepared, and it was 4 steps that they would always use before every single major examination across all subjects. They did it, it was tried, it was tested, and they repeated it. So that then if something, did go wrong in the exam or on the day of they were sick or, any of those eventualities, they were still able to perform well because they had prepared in a really solid way that they knew was reliable. So what I want to show you now are those 4 steps that I keep referring to that we talked Aaron through and we put into practice with Aaron to boost his marks, and those 4 steps as well that you can use with your children. So, step number 1. The first thing that we need to do before any exam is to establish our subject bias. So when I asked you in the questionnaire, what's your son or daughter's favourite subject and what's their least favourite subject, for Aaron, talking about the example, Aaron, a student that I met recently, for him, his least favourite subject was maths by absolute far. And so what tends to happen when a student doesn't like a subject, it's generally for one of these 4 reasons. So the first reason is often because they're not good at it. And what we mean by not good is that they're not getting an outcome that they feel is consistent with the amount of effort that they're putting in. So, they're trying as hard as they can, or at least they think that they're trying as hard as they can, and they're just not improving. They're not seeing any improvements there. Second reason is often because they don't like their teacher. This is what we tend to call an avoidance behaviour, because usually students are using this as an excuse not to put in extra effort. What I'm not saying here at all is that it's a teacher's fault, not at all. I'm just raising it here because it is something that we hear a lot from students. Third reason is often that students don't see a relevance in what they're learning. So they've sort of made up their mind already that this is not a subject they're going to need in their life. They don't really want to hear about it immediate term because they don't see that relevance. The fourth reason is often that students feel that maybe the content is insurmountable. So, for whatever reason, they've maybe fallen behind. They feel like now they have this mountain of work in front of them and it's a mountain that they can't climb. So they just give up before they've even got started. I know that this is a really big issue at the moment, after closures, earlier this year, is that students feel like that they're on the back foot and they've got so much catching up to do. And so running through these reasons, really, I'm not suggesting that any of them are true or false or that it's, a binary. In any case, I'm really just raising them because these are the things that students tend to vocalise to us. And once they vocalise them, once they believe that, they tend to turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. It leads them to, develop these sort of self-limiting beliefs where they're constantly telling themselves, oh, I'm not good at this subject. And when they're telling themselves that they're not good at it, it means that they tend to not prepare in the same way that they do for the subjects that they are good at, which means that usually their marks will suffer and they'll tend to struggle with that subject even more. So this is just a bias, like any other bias, and everybody has different levels of bias. So what is more important really is identifying it, but more important is understanding our biases. Why do they exist? And that's really, really critical for students right now. So to go back to Aaron, so Aaron and maths, his least favourite subject, what it turned out to be is that actually with maths, Aaron was putting in a lot less time, a lot less study than he was with his other subjects. Because he didn't like it, he was putting it off and he wasn't putting in that work. So first and foremost, really, it's really important that students have this framework to understand that although, they are doing many subjects, they are going to have to do well across the board in different subjects. So they've got to put, more hours into the subjects that they dislike because they'll tend to be putting in those hours usually in the subjects that they enjoy. That makes sense. So what this framework provides, it allows students to then see, they're probably going to score well in the subjects that they like and score worse in the subjects that they dislike by virtue of the prep that they've put in. And this, again, further reinforces these biases and just tends to exacerbate the issue. So what we did when we sat down with Aaron in coaching is we actually had him list all of the subjects that he was taking from top to bottom. We had him add a column for how difficult he found each subject, then another column for how enjoyable he found it, and then the third column on how much content he felt that he had to study. Then we got him to assess every subject across all of these metrics, scaling from a 1 to 5. So 1 being that he really, really enjoyed it, and 5 being that he found it really difficult. And I will show you an example of this chart in a minute, and it will be much, much clearer. So what we then did is after those scores, we totaled up the score for each subject, And it allowed us to have this overview, and it created a really interesting conversation that me and Aaron could have, because we could point to those subjects that were most at risk of this bias that we just discussed. And then we could talk about strategies to overcome that. So, as I said, here is an example of that chart that I was just talking about there that Aaron made. And so, as I said before, you can clearly see at the top there, maths. Maths has a combined score of 12, which was his highest, which is in that red zone. And what was really interesting actually here is that Aaron didn't find maths that difficult. You can see there in the difficulty column, he rated it a 2. So he didn't find it that difficult, but it was more the disliking and the feeling that there was so much content. And that's what actually came together to make it his most at-risk subject. And so the beauty of making this with Aaron was that afterwards, it enabled us to dig a little bit deeper into why did maths score a 5 in terms of content value. Because normally what we find is that there's actually quite a difference with students in what they feel is true and what is actually true. And this was a classic case of that, because actually for Aaron, that there was a lot less content in maths than he had thought. There was actually a lot less than some of the other subjects that had scored, lower than what he rated for maths. So because he disliked it, it tended to mean that when Aaron was working on maths, the time dragged and it felt like he had more to do than he actually did. Then he would start to dislike it, start to resent it, and that spiral would continue. Another really big breakthrough that we got from making this was when Anita, Aaron's mum, and Aaron had a conversation, because then it allowed Anita to sort of talk about her own experiences at school. And she was able to say, this is a subject that I didn't really like, but this is how I overcame it. And it also became okay for Aaron to admit, I just don't really like maths, because there is a lot of pressure on students to say, I love all of my subjects equally. And that just can't be true. We know that. So what this broad frame approach is really helpful for, especially at this time of year, is to allow students to see what they need to course correct for the rest of the year. They've got time to make these changes. We always just say that it is absolutely fine to feel differently about different subjects, but it's critical that you recognise that you feel a certain way about them so that you can troubleshoot those possible negative consequences and avoid, going down that pathway to just giving up on a subject entirely. So I hope that all makes sense. So really, just to summarise, a practical takeaway for you as parents and carers is to actually make this table, like we've got here, with your son or your daughter. Either have them do it independently, or even better, I would say, is to do it together and then have a conversation after about those subjects at the top that are maybe at risk of this bias and at risk of maybe being neglected, and talk about how you can practically solve that. So, as well, another benefit from that is that the self-awareness that will follow with a student making something like this and being able to understand why they don't like a subject, they can trace that back, and usually they will find that it's linked to, either a lack of activity on their part, or maybe some false information that they've told themselves to sort of protect themselves. So this is really the macro perspective on exams, understanding which subjects might be favoured over others. So now we want to zone in and we want to look at the micro perspective. So what is actually happening within individual subjects? And again, to use Aaron as an example, we made a document together that helped him understand the volume of content and the difficulty for each subject. And that's what we're going to look at now in step 2. So step 2 is using your specification, a word that has already come up this evening. So we do say a lot about specification to students, but when I tend to ask parents, at our parent seminars that we do in schools, I'll say, who knows what a specification is? Raise your hand. Usually about 40 to 50%, I would say, of parents sort of raise their hand tentatively and say, yeah, I think I do. And then I say, okay, you'll keep your hand up if you've actually ever seen your child's specification for a couple of subjects. Usually hands drop, and we're usually only left with maybe about 10 to 20% of parents who say that they have actually seen them. So obviously there is a big difference between knowing what something is and actually using it. So for you as parents and carers, I want to answer 2 really core questions. So the first being, how should your child use their specifications? And secondly, how should you as parents and carers use their specifications? So these are obviously very important questions to answer, because if you've never seen one of these documents before, you're going in dark, you don't really know what it is. Also, what that tends to mean is that you might not know what your child needs to revise, which might lead to those frustrating conversations, which I'm sure many of you have had, when you're sort of saying to your child, oh, okay, so, what do you need to revise? Where are you at with your revision or with your study? Sometimes students may get a little defensive about that, and it can become a bit of a point of tension. So before I dive into that, some of you right now may be saying, Molly, what is a specification? Please define it for me. So as I said sort of briefly earlier, a specification is a document that contains absolutely everything that a student needs to learn in that course, how they're going to be examined, and the skills that they need to demonstrate. So it lists everything that a student will be assessed on, breaking it down unit by unit. So again, if we use this document, if we use this specification as a sort of a central point of truth, you remove that ambiguity from these potential arguments. You're no longer speaking with your child at cross purposes and sort of arguing over what does or doesn't need to happen. Instead, you can actually both speak through this specification and point objectively to what needs to be revised and what has already been revised. So the next question to answer really is, what does a specification look like? And, where do you get it from? Where do you download it? And how do you use it as well, crucially, alongside that chart that we've just made? So let me dive into that. So as I said before, specifications can be found for every subject on the exam board website for that GCSE or A level. So if your child is not yet on a GCSE course, if they're year 9 or below, you can find the Key Stage 3 National Curriculum, which is found on the government website. It is slightly different. It doesn't go into as much detail, but it's still really, really useful resource. So with GCSEs and A levels on these exam board websites, again, as a side note, if you don't know or your child doesn't know what exam board they're on for a specific subject, no worries at all, just ask their teacher and they will definitely know. So when you go onto the exam board website, you go to the subject and it will usually say specification right there at the top. Click on that. That will either be the full specification, or you can dive into the area that will say subject content, and the topics will be listed under there. Some specifications use the term learning outcomes, which we've got on the slide there, or qualification objectives. These all mean the same thing. And so then underneath the heading of a topic, there will be a couple of bullet points stating exactly and precisely what students will be assessed on and what they need to know. So as an example, say for chemistry, there might be a subject, a topic saying acids and salts, or for maths, it might be equations or calculus, some subtopics like that. So what they then do, broken underneath that in bullet points, is it really clearly dictates what a student needs to know. And then once a student is actually comfortable using this document throughout the year and in revision, they are much less likely to be surprised when they go into an exam about, the phrasing of the questions or what the questions are actually asking them to do. They're more likely to be confident, and of course that leads to, hopefully, they're more likely to get those top marks as well. And we can take this process one step further, really, by scoring each learning outcome bullet point on how difficult it is going to be to learn. And this is what Aaron actually did. This is what we did in coaching with Aaron. We went through every single subtopic and then every single bullet point below that. And we used a traffic light system similar to the one that Megan would have spoken about in September in her webinar. So effectively, anything that Aaron read that was like, oh, this is difficult, this is really tricky, I'm going to mark that red. Anything that he was on his way to understanding or, a sort of work in progress, that is orange. And then anything that he's like, yep, confident on this, I could answer a question on this right now, that goes in green. And then, of course, this can then inform how Aaron actually revised and how your children can revise as well. Because instead of going over absolutely everything that he had learnt that year before his exams, he could just go to his specification and he could just turn those reds into orange and those orange into green. So it definitely saved him time and eliminates stress as well. So if your child wants to boost their marks and also save a bit of time, don't we all? This is really the key, using their specification. Because as we said before, really, students tend to study what they like and neglect what they don't like, that bias coming into play again. And In almost all cases, the information that they will highlight in green or tick in green is that information or those topics that they enjoy. It's human nature. We like the stuff that, makes sense to us and that we're good at as well. But when it comes to exam prep, what we don't want to be doing is wasting a lot of time on that green information and just treading over stuff that we already know. Instead, we want to eliminate all of our blind spots, and we want to zone in on that red information, because that is the areas that we have room for improvement and room to gain more marks as well. The other benefit of this process is that it's really motivating for students, because what I always say is, when you've highlighted something green, keep it there. If you're doing it digitally, don't delete it, keep it so that you can see all of that green and you can see your progression as you're moving those reds to orange and orange to greens. And actually what tends to happen is when a student goes through the specification for the first time, there's a lot more green information than they thought that there would actually be. They'll know a lot more than they thought that they did. So the sort of end outcome of this task, and what all students should be striving for, is to have a set of notes on every single bullet point in the specification, ideally also highlighted or ticked in green, because then that they know that they have notes, they understand that information, and they can effectively walk into any exam with 100% certainty that they have all of the knowledge that they need to answer the questions. They may not necessarily know how to apply that information. We're going to get into that in a moment. But what they do have, if they've done this cross-check between their specification and their notes, is they know that they have all the information that they need. Fantastic. So this is just an example from a chemistry specification to show you what one would look like. So what you can see here on the slide, what you would want to do is go through those A, B, C, D, E, F, G. These are the learning outcomes, and then we want to tick them either red, orange, or green for the level of difficulty or how well we feel that we know them. So again, like I said before, really revision just becomes a case of eliminating those blind spots, and it becomes so much easier to then prepare a robust study plan when we've already done this groundwork with the specification. Fantastic. So that is step 2. Taken care of. So now, we've taken that macro view of your child's subjects. We've understood their attitudes to each subject. We've gone into them a little bit deeper to understand what they need to learn and what topic areas they're strong on, what topic areas they're a bit weaker on. So now we want to pull all of that information together and prepare a structured plan. And this was the number one variable that we found in our 19 years of research across with millions and millions of students. We found that students who have a systematic way of preparing and do these very specific types of work, they will always be the students who perform better in exams. So let's dive into what those areas are. Step 3. I'm just going to take a tiny sip of water. Lovely. So moving on to step 3, which is structured and deliberate preparation. And so before I just go into how this actually works, I want to just clearly define the problem that it's looking to solve. So the problem is the last minute cram. I am sure that many of you, if not all of you as parents of carers, have seen your child in this situation where they are cramming the night before an exam, or they're waking up super early the morning of an exam and trying to get that last minute revision in. Possibly you yourselves have been in that situation. I definitely can say that I have. So what we want to do is obviously eliminate that. And when we conducted some research into the way that students were approaching exam preparation, we found that 80% of the 12,000 students that we surveyed were beginning their exam preparation less than 2 weeks before an exam. This is one of the worst ways to prepare, really, because there's only certain types of work that you can focus on when you don't have that much time to prepare. Generally, if you start your preparation too late, really all you can focus on is just the information. Just getting as much information into your mind as possible that you know that you're going to be tested on. However, obviously, the negative to this means that you don't get to focus on the application of that information. So these students, will download the information, perhaps retain a huge amount of it, but they don't practice how to use it, and as a result, they generally don't perform very well in exams. This is often the case when you find students who do incredibly well across their academic career, really great at homework, but then for some reason, in the exam, they can't sort of convert that to marks. Tends to be to do with this preparation stage. So again, on the flip side, the students who do perform best in exams, they start their preparation earlier than this. So we'd be talking 3, 4 or plus weeks from the exam date, so that they have time to do these very distinct, clear things that we have here on the screen, which I'm going to talk you through in a moment. And the benefits really to this structured approach is, firstly, like we said before, it allows students to focus on that practice. The area that we found is the key variable for whether students tend to perform well or not. And secondly, another sort of huge benefit to this is that it will tend to decrease overwhelm and anxiety. So again, something that we really found with Aaron, he experienced that anxiety before with his exams. We were really trying to target that, and this allowed him to target it. What he tended to find is that he had a way of preparing, but he didn't know how to scale that up from sort of doing one unit test or one end of term test to scaling it up for GCSEs when you've got 7 or more subjects all running concurrently. And I'm sure that many of you who have children on GCSE or A-level courses can relate to this as well. So what we want to bring it back to really is creating this centralised framework that can just, get him out of that frame of mind of being overwhelmed and just focus in on one task at a time. So essentially, really, the key thing that we're trying to solve here is a student's lack of focus. So how do we help them prioritise what is the most important at this really critical time pre-exam? So the framework looks like this. It is a framework that you can use across every single subject. And at minimum, we would say this framework here that you have on your screen, it should take place minimum across 3 weeks. So 1 week on each stage. But of course, if your child can extend that, or if we're talking about, higher up their academic ladder, we could expand that to say 2 weeks for each stage. So 2 weeks for notes, 2 weeks for memory, 2 weeks for practice papers, or even more than that. So the first step we want to be doing at least 3 weeks before the exam, and that first step there you can see is finishing our notes. The optimum word there is finishing. We don't want to be making new notes from scratch. If a student finds that they are tending to make new notes for revision, what actually tends to happen is they will be focusing on sort of rote learning techniques, which are less effective ways of studying. So if you find as a parent or carer that you see that your child is tending to rewrite their notes a lot, maybe retyping their notes as well, or rereading their notes constantly, and that's the sort of the main task that they're doing for revision, this is a little bit of a sort of red flag, and we want to move them away from that, because whilst that work sort of creates an illusion of productivity, it makes students feel very busy, they've got a lot to do, it tends to actually not be that productive. Because what we're doing is we're just going over information that we already know, as we spoke about before. So a much more productive use of their time would be to internalise that stuff, to memorise that information, and then actually practice it, put it into effect. So again, when we're talking about this finishing notes, what's really, really important, going back to step 2, is to be using our specification so that we have that really clear checklist on what should be in our notes. So we can cross-check, as we said before, and say, okay, so here are these bullet points. Do I have something for each bullet point in my notes? And again, using that traffic light system, have I got them all turned to green? So that's really important. Another little benefit of having that specification checklist is when you tick something off, you get that lovely little hit of dopamine, that reward chemical that makes us just feel good about ourselves, and we're more likely to achieve the rest of that list. And another thing that parents actually often ask about this stage, about finishing notes, is where sort of supplementary textbooks and handouts from teachers come in. So anything like that should definitely be included in their notes. But what's really important is, if it's a resource that a student hasn't written themselves, is that they annotate those resources. The reason for that is so that they definitely understand the content. So Megan would have touched on this in her webinar in September. It's really important that when students are taking any notes at all, that they are condensing and they're writing it in their own words, not just sort of word for word from the board. Again, it's just simply so that they are engaging with it, they're more likely to understand it, and then they're more likely to memorize it. So this is less important really for those green ticks or that green information, because they already get that, but very, very important for those red ticks and those orange ticks as well, for the stuff that they're struggling to grasp. So moving on to the second step, after they've finished their notes, the next thing that they should be doing is memorising those notes. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, just because I have about 2 hours worth of sort of memory content that I could dive into, and I completely understand you guys want to get away just after 7. Also, we are actually developing a webinar specifically about memorisation, which is going to be available early next year, next term. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. All I will say is that generally with memorization, what we want to be doing is making it active rather than passive whenever students are memorizing notes from any subject. So an example of that may be saying their notes aloud. It may be teaching their notes to you or to a sibling or to a peer or a friend or even a pet. They don't have to talk back. It's just that process that we're making active. Another way is students could listen to recordings of themselves reading their notes. Then they could make additional notes while they're listening to it. They could create mind maps, put them up around the house so they're engaging with it regularly. However they want to do it, as long as it is active, that is the most key thing. They're more likely to retain that information if they do it in that way. It's really just like a sort of a classic example of cognitive memory theory, which essentially means if you use it, then you're fine. If you don't, you're going to lose it. So use it or lose it. The brain is an amazing thing, and it's amazingly efficient. So that information that we're storing that we're not using, it assumes that it is just not important, disregards it, and it will, put in other information that we're using more regularly. So that's the sort of most important thing for memory, is active rather than passive. So moving on then to the final stage of this 3-step exam preparation process, it's practice papers, which I know is a term that's come up a few times this evening and definitely more than a few times in our other webinars. So this stage really here with practice papers, it's not about sort of saying your son or daughter has to be chained to a desk and doing, practice paper after practice paper constantly. Obviously, quantity is important when it comes to practice, but more so is quality. So what they should be doing with practice papers is practicing often, but more importantly, practicing deliberately, intentionally, and perfectly. So one component of practicing perfectly is using that process that Megan spoke about in September, when she was talking about moving from doing practice papers open book, open time, then moving to closed book, open time, and then finally moving to exam conditions. So that's an example of a really, really perfect way to practice. Another example, another component of perfectly practicing is learning from the mistakes that we've already made. So this was a really big thing actually for Aaron, is what we found is that he had a couple of other subject-specific tutors that he was working with. He was doing additional work, which was fantastic. He was getting it marked, but he wasn't actually zoning in on the mistakes that he'd made. So what we were able to do is sort of link up with those tutors and make sure that Aaron was actually going, okay, what are the questions that I've got wrong? Why did I get them wrong? I'm going to learn from that, and I'm not going to make that same mistake twice. So if we can do this, obviously we're sort of developing those metacognitive skills, so our thinking about our own thinking. That allows students to become more self-aware, like we've said before, and also just sort of elevate to a higher level of learning. So as a parent, your practical takeaway really from this step is that if your child is 1 week out from their exam, from the start date of their exam, and they're still making notes or they're still rereading their textbooks, they're probably not going to do so well. So what we want to be doing is in that final week before the exam, we want to just be focusing on practice. So at this late stage, they really just want to be applying their knowledge, applying their skills, and that's going to really help them in their preparation. A common pushback that we do get on this model that I've just outlined there is that students often say to us, they don't get notified of their assessments or their tests with more than 2 weeks' notice. My advice to those students always is, if you can keep your notes as up to date as possible, if you are using that specification throughout the year to make your notes, as soon as you have an area that you've missed or you find difficult, you zone in and you actually correct that, then what we've got is we're starting from a really, really strong position. Finishing off those notes should barely take any time at all. Then we're going to have that time to memorize and to do those practice papers as well. Again, if you find for whatever reason that you don't have 2 weeks to prepare, you've got less than that, what we tend to say to students is finish the notes quickly and efficiently, and then skip that middle phase of memorization and go straight to practice papers. That is because when we're doing practice papers, we are also memorizing. It is a form of active memorization. So if for whatever reason we're in a bit of a tricky situation and we've got less than those 2 weeks, we would say skip out that memorization section in the middle. However, of course, ideally we want to be giving ourselves, 3+ weeks to fit in all of these 3 types of work and be as prepared as we possibly can. Wonderful. So, to give you a sort of a practical example of what this would look like, this is what Aaron and I made, and this is something that, of course, you could do with your own children. So we made a really simple Gantt chart. You can see here, it's nothing fancy. It's literally just subjects going down in rows, and then for the columns, we have different weeks. And then for each subject, we just say, well, what stage of the exam preparation process are you going to be at in that week? And then you can see all of the other subjects running alongside that. This then gives students a really clear idea of how they're going to work through their revision for each subject simultaneously, because that can be really hard. Because the risk for a risk that happens a lot, is that when they are studying for multiple exams at the same time, is that, again, like we said before, that bias will come into play and they're going to favour one subject over another, and other subjects are going to get neglected. So this way of mapping it out in this form is really helpful to ensure that all subjects are getting sort of due attention and the attention that they need. And with Anita and Aaron, what Anita actually did is she printed 3 copies of this. She laminated them as well at work. One of them went on the fridge, one of them went above Aaron's desk, and one of them went on the back of the bathroom door. So what this meant is that there were constant reminders around the house for Aaron and for Anita of this timeline that Aaron was working towards. And again, I will say this timeline, it does not need to be stuck to 100% of the time. Just like we discussed in the previous webinar about time management, any sort of exam planner, weekly planner, study timetable, it's a guide rather than a rule. It's just something that we want to try to stick to, and if we don't want to beat ourselves up about it. I happen to know for a fact that physics timeline that's running along there, Aaron did not manage to stick to that. He put off his note-taking a bit, and he found that he couldn't get to that memorization quite as quickly. However, when he was in the memorization, it actually took him a bit less time than he thought. So actually, he did manage to get back on track for the practice papers. So again, like I said, it's a guide, not a rule. It's there to help your children. And my recommendation as well for all of you is when you find yourself about 6 weeks out from your child's exam block, walk through this process with them. That's the best time to be making this. Print a number of copies, like we said, put it everywhere. The reason for that is, I'm sure you'll have all heard of the phrase, out of sight, out of mind. This is sort of the reverse of that. So we're saying, put it constantly in their line of sight so it will be at the front of their mind. Not quite as catchy, but it really is really important here. And so I'm sure that a lot of you who joined our previous webinar about time management as well are sort of thinking, okay, well, how does this fit in with that weekly planner that we were talking about before? So my advice really would be to map out this whole revision period like this, on a Gantt chart like this, but then still sit down every week and do that weekly planner to identify what tasks exactly need to be done and map those out. So to break down that finishing notes, that memorization, that practice papers into individual tasks that can then be ticked off. The reason for that is, of course, 1, less overwhelming, and 2, if we have a precise list of specific tasks we need to get done, it's going to be easier. So, an example of that, I could give you an example now. So if it was biology, it might be, rather than just memorize notes, it would be memorize notes on cell structures, something like that. Great, so we will jump into the final step 4, before we move on to that Q&A at the end of the session. I will just say, usually, when I walk families through this process that we're looking at now, they tend to get to this stage and their next question is usually, okay, well, there is a lot here, there's a lot to do. How are we going to bring all of this together? And that's what we're going to go through now in this final stage. We're going to be discussing how to actually make that exam planner, breaking down that work, as I said before. And I am well aware that a lot of students, the idea of making an exam planner, is not something that they maybe want to do, that tends to be because seeing everything laid out in front of us, it can look really hard. It can look a little bit boring. It can look little bit overwhelming. So we need to be quite mindful about how we frame this use of exam planners and how we put them together. And that's what I'm going to run through now. So you can see here for step 4, using an exam planner, this is an example of a plan that Aaron created. So what we're trying to do here is we're bringing together those 3 steps that we talked about before, 1, 2, and 3, all together into one place. So it might feel like a bit of work, but actually making this, Aaron's coach took him through this process, everything that we've spoken about this evening, in just 2 sessions. So that's 2 hours in total. So 2 hours to do everything that we've discussed tonight, and then to start executing these tasks confidently and effectively, and definitely more efficiently than he would have otherwise. So the example that you can see in front of you here of Aaron's planner, you can see that chemistry is the subject that we've gone for, and what we've made here is we've got column A obviously being subject, column B is the type of action, so those actions directly come from that previous step we talked about, so either finishing notes, memorization, or practice papers. Then column C is the action taken, so the specific task, and again, the more specific a student can be, the better, because it's the more likely that they'll actually get it done. And this is actually a really important point, just to expand a little bit here, because I'm sure many of you have had this situation either in the work environment or maybe when you were at school as well. Is think about times, let's say at work, in a board meeting, you're putting together, what you want to achieve this week. It's Monday morning. How often is it that you sort of make a list of the actions that you want to get done, and none of them are completed, or some of them aren't completed because they just lack specificity? When we have a lack of specificity with our tasks, we're more likely to procrastinate, because we're more likely to spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to get that done, or what it actually is that we need to do, as opposed to just getting our head down and actually getting on with that task. So specificity is so key here. Actually, when Aaron's coach gave him some feedback on this exam planner that we've got here, we said, let's make it a bit more specific. So where you can see in cell C2, where it says bonding and structure, we actually said, okay, instead of saying that, let's say bonding and structure on page 6 of your textbook. Again, the more specific we can be, the more likely he's going to be able to go, what is that again? Oh yeah, great. I'll just grab my textbook, flick to page 6 and get on with it. Column D, then moving on past that, that's how long it would take to do that task. So giving it a sort of an estimated time is really, really useful. Especially because usually students are revising alongside doing homework, so we need to know how much time they're going to spend. Column E is then the deadline, and crucially, this should be the deadline for each individual task, not just the actual exam date for that subject. The reason for this is that it's human nature, we all do it. If we're given a certain amount of time to do a task, we will expand that task to fit that time. We will always just, make a task fit however long we have to do it. So if we put just the deadline of Aaron's chemistry when his actual exam was going to be, I promise you, he would definitely not have got all of this done. So instead, what we need to do is give each action, each task, a mini deadline to go alongside it. Then the final column there, column F, that's really important just as a motivator. So it's the status column, and a status should either be not started, work in progress, or WIP, as you can see there, or done. And I think I mentioned this before, but I always say to my students as well, when you complete one of these tasks or complete an action, don't delete it. Mark it as done, mark it as green, and leave it there, because it's such a motivating thing to come back to this and see all of those things that are in green that you've already done and the work that you've already achieved. The other thing that actually isn't in this example, but would be a really useful thing to add in, is to add a little notes section next to each action on just whether in the specification it was something that was a red tick, an orange tick, or a green tick. That will obviously then allow your children as well to know, that's an area that I'm struggling on, so that might take a little bit more time. So yeah, it's a really, really useful thing to add if you can. The final thing as well, before I move on to the Q&A, is I just want to talk really briefly about how you would implement this process yourself. So you could obviously do it on paper, The benefits to that is that it can be a nice process. If your child is creative, they'll really enjoy that. And also you have the satisfaction of, crossing off those things as you do them. Or alternatively, you could make it digitally, as Aaron did here, on a Google spreadsheet or whatever other software that you use. The benefit to that is that you can then both have access to it. So as a parent and child, you can both have access to this one document, which is really useful. Then you can print it off as well and have as many copies as you like. And really, whichever route you take, of paper or digital, the main thing is that you have a high degree of accountability. So as long as both people, parents and student, have got eyes on this document, that is the real key here. And one thing as well you might want to consider is possibly your child doing this process, making this exam planner with a friend, someone in their class, or maybe a sibling. That can add in that extra little bit of gamification, which is fun, a little bit of a competitive element. So let me just move on. I'm going to wrap up now with our 3 key takeaways for you. So just summarizing everything. So takeaway number 1 is to consider all subjects using this framework for difficulty, likability, and volume of content. The reason we use that framework is to ensure that we're not prioritizing one subject over another purely because we like one and we dislike another. So that's that macro view. So takeaway number 2 is using your specification as a checklist. So if you haven't downloaded these yet, I highly recommend you do so. You won't need the whole document, but as we said before, zoning in on those learning outcomes, that core content that your child is going to know in every single subject. And again, if you are confused at all about exam boards or which exam board your child is with, go to your teacher and they will absolutely know that. So, final thing to add here as well, really, really clear for GCSEs and A-levels. If your child is in year 9 or below, then just go to the government website and you can look at the Key Stage 3 revision guides and course outlines there. Great. And our final takeaway is that 3-step process that we just talked about. So whenever readying ourselves for an exam, we want to be finishing our notes, we want to be memorizing them, and then we want to be putting it into practice. So now, that is everything from me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for attending this webinar on exam preparation. I really hope that you've got some great tips there to implement with your own children. What we're going to be doing next month is we're going to be doing a session on stress and well-being, a topic that I know is a big concern for many of you. That's going to be on the 1st of December, and that's going to be the final webinar for this term. So if you have registered for that, fantastic. If you haven't, then just make sure you do so by clicking on the registration box below, if you're on our website, or if you're on YouTube, just clicking on that link, hopping to our website and registering there. And the final thing, again, if you're interested in coaching or how Elevate could work privately with you as a family and with your children, then just book in a phone appointment with Charlie or one of the senior coaching team. And you do that by going to the embedded calendar that's below, and you can just pick a time slot. I will say that time slots go very, very quickly. So if you are interested in talking to us a little bit more about coaching and implementing some of these tips, I would say book now to avoid disappointment. And then we'll give you a ring and we can set up diagnostics from there. Fantastic. So we're going to do a brief Q&A. Apologies that we are bang on 7 now. If you do need to go for whatever reason, Charlie, the head of coaching, will be sending round an FAQ list from this evening's questions that are sent in, and you'll get that in a couple of days via email. Wonderful. Great. So, okay, so a question that I have here, I'll just read this to you, is with COVID, there is a risk that any exams in the next couple of years could be replaced by coursework in-class assessments, mock exams, etc. How do you maintain focus throughout the whole course of the year for that eventuality? So, yeah. That is a really, really important question, and it's a question that we've been getting a lot recently, actually, with obviously, some uncertainties around exams. And the importance really should be is that we still want to be applying that process for a piece of coursework or for anything that we need to be handing in. So we still want to be talking about finishing notes, about having some notes on it, having some research, memorizing, and then actually putting it into practice as well. So we want to be, treating any piece of coursework or any mock test, any test at all, just as we would with a real exam. The focus, really, in that question there, how can we maintain focus? That really ties into goal setting. So that is something that we will be speaking about more in the future, and there's a lot more information on our website, on our YouTube channel. But effectively, to maintain focus, what we want to do is we want to have long-term and mid-term goals that we can check in with regularly. So I would recommend that maybe you could sit down with your child and just discuss what goals do they have at the moment. So what goals, what marks do they want to get on upcoming tests? What do they want to be studying for GCSE A-level? Have they got any thoughts beyond that? And if they can get that codified and written down, and even better than that is making it visual, if they can have something that they can emotionally connect with, that will hopefully provide that focus for them to sustain them. Great, I hope that's answered the question. Lovely. Okay, I'm just getting a note from Charlie that actually we do need to wrap up. I don't want to keep you guys any longer than 7. So what Charlie's going to do is create that FAQ document for you, which will have questions from you guys and answers from us at Elevate, and she'll send that via email. And finally, I just want to add that we will definitely be doing a webinar on goal setting and on motivation later in the year, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Fantastic. My final thing is just to say, again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar this evening. I really hope it's been useful for you. And if you'd like to know anything more about Elevate or about coaching, please just get in contact with us, with Charlie, who's the head of coaching, and we'll give you a call back. Thank you so much and have a lovely rest of your evening.